This essay was included in a book of essays about men and nature. In 2004, the University of Virginia Press published a book entitled Eco Man: New Perspectives on Masculinity and Nature. This was edited by Mark Allister. In September of 2009, the essay was edited to a shorter version, translated into Norwegian, and published in Dag O Tid. I love the single deer path. It begins with my poem, I love the single deer path. I love the single deer path, winding into the wet, tangly night woods, where nocturnal squirrels and whippoorwills usually fly tree to tree. The hunter walks from the known to the not known, and water drops from leaf to leaf. The humus grows moist, still, and womanly. Hunters walk in life and take a life in order to feed life, or they hunt ritually to express how meaningful the hunt has been for the continuation of life. To me, now, it is that simple. I grew up in a household of conscientious and disciplined hunters. My dad and uncles taught us to respectfully hunt rabbits, ducks, pheasants, and ruffed grouse. We ate what we hunted, or gave the game to old-timers who relished the meat. However, when I reached my mid-20s, I quit hunting. 10 years later, when my son was born, I returned to hunting. This essay tells some of the reasons why I left hunting and then returned to it. From my earliest years, I lived with the imagery and a sensory awareness of meat as food. My father was a meat cutter in St. Paul. One of my uncles raised cattle on his farm, where I spent many weeks each year with my cousins, and where Dad taught me to hunt ducks on the back field pothole. My grandfather had been a South Dakota cowboy before he married and moved to St. Paul. And he told me story after story about being a ranch hand on the prairie. His brother drove cattle trucks from South Dakota to the South St. Paul stockyards. And whenever he stayed overnight with us in the cities, I slept on our family couch. When he returned to Dakota, my bed glowed with the rich odors of diesel fuel, animal hair, manure, and cattle feed, soulful, intimate, and unashamed odors. Because my father worked in a city supermarket, some of my earliest memories are of meat behind a glass counter, a sawdust floor, sparkling knives, and whirring bandsaws. The year I began high school, Dad began to cut up deer for hunters. This extra work brought in money for our large Catholic family, and we developed a small, seasonal family business. The profits paid for Catholic school tuitions, family necessities, and most importantly today, hunting land in northern Minnesota. When we processed the deer, my task was to skin the hide and then, before sending the quarters of meat to my father, to burn off the sticking, hollow winter hairs with a propane torch. Small tulips of smoke would lift into the darkness above the garage's loft joists. I will always have memories of the odors of burning deer hair, cold venison, a doe's suet, and a stag's dirty rectum. In 10 years, I skinned over 700 deer. I know well how a deer's bared ribs feel, and venison hams, and slippery bone knuckles. As the deer skinner, I had to listen to each man tell his kill story, the area where he hunted, the type of cover, the quiet spot where he stood or sat or leaned against the tree, the way the deer approached, its head movements and antler swings. Having heard 10 stories like it the day before, I was unimpressed. Yet, because they were customers, I never stopped a story. My restraint was not due to respect. I was an arrogant, introverted college boy among working class men. Because these men craved to tell their stories, as men should, and because most were never taught how to tell stories without a beer in hand, we were at odds. One evening, an especially obnoxious braggart insisted on prattling his expertise to me. I realized that I could probably chase him from the garage if I turned the radio from familiar, if disliked, hippie music to the more mysterious classical music. I found a classical music broadcast from St. John's in Collegeville, Minnesota. When I returned to my work, he continued to babble. However, his words became fewer and fewer, and his babble more disjointed. Finally, there was silence. I looked at him. He stared at me like a deer in the middle of a highway. Then I became conscious of the sensory impact of my work. I moved and worked intently with a slender knife in my hand. I wore a bloodied white meat cutter's smock. A half-skunned deer carcass hung from darkness, and its gaping chest cavity exposed inner ribs and blackened blood clots. Yellowish fat wrapped the back strap, and folded skin flaps held soft white belly hair, while a full pink doe teat dripped milk to the concrete floor. Through the garage's odors swirled the sublime music of Jesu, joy of man's desiring. The hunter froze in the midst of this beauty in blood. We two stood at the edge of something larger than we understood. I could feel, though just barely, the spiritual power pulled into the garage by the music. He left the garage, and I went back to work. I did not understand why such moments were so spiritually powerful, but I felt something. From the first day I hunted with a shotgun and refused to kill living pigeons just to practice my skills. I had questions about my own hunting as death dealing. What happens to animals when they die? When I kill one, am I evil? Is there a spiritual realm beyond this earthly world where the souls of animals and humans continue in a different existence? I instinctively knew that the hunting and killing of another creature was a core activity for the human soul and for human sustenance. A hunt is not a hunt unless there is a threat that something dies. The conscientious hunter must accept this. He cannot turn away and absolve himself from his participation in death dealing. Neither could I dismiss the vitality I felt while hunting as irrelevant. I sensed that there was a spiritual dimension in hunting. My father and uncles accepted hunting as normal, worldly behavior and let it be at that. Our parish priests could not answer my question about hunting's value to the soul. At this time, I knew nothing about the attitudes of indigenous hunters, and I did not realize that my questions were part of a human being's maturation process. I felt only guilt and confusion. A blanket of bravado wrapped most of the hunters I knew in a state of psychological denial. The commercialization of the natural outdoors, the merchandising of the hunt, the welcome hunters signs on taverns, the governmental need to manage prey kills with bag limits and seasons, the cityfication of the American culture, and the rising awareness of ecological disasters stifled respectful discussions and encouraged blustery and defensive rhetoric among the hunters I knew. My exposure to relevant writings and opinions was limited to Time magazine, Sports Afield, and Outdoor Life. I never felt rooted in a literary or religious system that could give authority to my beliefs. The only serious hunting literature I knew of glorified killing or tried to emulate Hemingway's work, which I did not yet understand. Nor was I interested in the work of someone who would kill himself. I secretly loved poetry, yet I could not find poems, serious poems, about hunting or its relevance to spirituality. Recently, I looked back at some of my poems, which I wrote when I was 22 years old. My themes were the same themes I work with today. That beauty and the natural world depend upon a great recycling of living things. That the shadow side of rational, scientific thinking is fear, especially a fear of life's unpredictability, which then creates in us a craving for safety and purity. I was clearly seeking a spirituality in nature and an awareness of my own natural soul. The invigorating excitement of a hunt added another layer of meaning to my quest. The word soul darts into and through many of those poems. They speak of absolutions, rebirths, and holy wisdom. Here are a few lines pulled from a rambling poem. In the city, my soul becomes an urban skeleton, an abandoned infant decaying in a can. In the pine, I am a fresh intruder, but still wet with stink. Animals flee because my mother has not licked me clean. Like a devil, tension is cast out by the holy spirits of the elements, and the weight of sunlight through needles and boughs forces age into the crevices inside of me, fills those cracks, and packs oldness into my inner spaces. I knew almost nothing of the spirituality of other people. After 12 years of Catholic education, many as an altar boy, after 2 years at the University of Minnesota where my Catholic education was challenged, I began to question my religious background. In my professed faith and spirituality, I was completely Catholic. However, the natural world was infusing me with a deeper sense of spirituality I was struggling to understand. I had been taught that animals did not have souls, yet I felt differently. When my friends and I killed animals, we would go drink beer to celebrate. Such drinking numbed my soul. I just wanted to be one of the guys, and I desired a natural participation in the wilderness. These are contrary desires, and I was not ready to choose one over the other. I wanted wisdom, and I wanted to avoid the burden of my dilemma, which was, why does one soul have to kill another? The human body senses things deeply while on a hunt. My physical senses were heightened, and as an undisciplined person, I had difficulties coping with such heightened awareness. My eyes saw more textures, movements, subtleties, and patterns. Scents were innumerable and poignant. The range of sound was vaster than anywhere else. More importantly, the possibility of enormous silence gave my life a larger potentiality. My soul quaked under the burden of its growing awareness. It was exhilarating and expansive. To survive and not yield to numbness or fear, my awareness of myself had spread out. But it also condensed. The pulse of awareness, inward, outward, was as important to my vitality, maybe even more so, as the pulse of my physical heart. I also learned that nature itself kills with brutality. Cruelty, ugliness, and violence are as inherent as beauty, harmony, and peace. For instance, the most courageous struggle of a small vole may be while it dies in the elegant goshawk's talons. As the beak rips the vole's flesh, so fledglings can eat. To comprehend the beauty and vitality of nature, one must hold the paradoxes of life and death in the soul. During the Depression, my dad's family revered pheasants, squirrels, the wild woods because they survived by both legal hunting and poaching. After the Depression ended, they continued to hunt and fish. They valued the unique beauty of the birds, the cleverness by which animals survive, and the challenges of an intensely lived life. The ritual gathering of food and the ritual killing for meat reminded them of the precariousness of life. They enjoyed being alive. My brothers, cousins, and I inherited this enjoyment, and I attempted to bring its vitality and paradoxes into the hidden life of my poems. One autumn, Dan took a break from his wildlife management studies. I, too, had decided to skip a quarter or two of college. We spent 6 weeks hunting and fishing every day, along the lake, down the small rivers, and through the flooded swamps where Dan also set traps for muskrats. Mostly, however, I scribbled lines about my inner struggles. Here's a stanza from one poem. I place my faith upon his skill to supply the meat for our meal. As helmsman, I guide the canoe, not by stars, but by a thrill of the hunt and forced survival in the wild. Only death may decide. I knew intuitively that to mature, we had to understand the meaning of survival. Of course, we would not starve, but we had to act as if we might. My poetic exaggeration was a form of a prayer. We were unconsciously ritualizing the sustenance of life through the hunt, and the hunt ritualized our family's story, which in turn is the story of humankind's struggle. But as a young man of the times, I was also asking, am I serving death or life? It was the autumn of 1972, a time when death and dying were imagistically ubiquitous. I needed to differentiate between the death dealing in hunting and the death dealing in warfare. The Vietnam War had brought more violence and threats of violence to my life. Violent images spread through the media. My friends returned from the war with rage and wounds. In 1970, my own conscription was prevented at the last minute by the severe acne which had erupted on my body. I was sent home from the induction center only minutes before the other draftees began their trip to boot camp. Despite the summer of love enthusiasms of the rock and roll 60s, death energy had overtaken the iconography of my generation. Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, Mama Cass, and others had died as drug-using rock idols. Altamont had followed Woodstock. Because I secretly dreamed of being a poet, John Berryman's notorious suicide, while I sat in class across the campus, gave death a greater imprint on my mind. A more personal tragedy had occurred in 1969. My 9-year-old brother John died from a brain tumor. We witnessed his bouts of pain on the family sofa, and we watched him suffer through his surgery, radiation treatments, and final miseries. In 1972, my family still lived in the shadow of the simple question: why was an innocent child taken by such a cancer? My poetic exaggeration, only death may decide, was, therefore, not an exaggeration to my soul. My immature abilities focused on the power of death. Young men do, naturally and instinctively, move toward the edge of chaos, where creativity emerges and death challenges their survival. Whether consciously or unconsciously, young people need to prove to themselves and to their community that they are capable of sustaining their own lives and that they are useful to others in the ever-changing motions of life. To do so, they have always gone to the edges of their culture or community. Dan and I were in the darkness of emerging manhood. We had entered the great, tangly night woods of northern Minnesota, and each of us followed a path into the unknown. We were looking for the elemental experiences which would enliven us with hope, healing solace, explanations, and reverence. Years later, the Mayan spiritual teacher, Martin Prechtel, explained that we were trying to initiate ourselves into the mysteries of life. Our instinctive attempts were noteworthy, but futile. Self-initiation is not possible. An older, experienced person must consciously lead a young person to the edge of life's mysteries if the maturation is to be life-enhancing and life-respecting. When faced with the enormous power of death, the young one will emotionally shut down or begin to move toward insanity if not accompanied by an elder's attention. Here is a small-scale example. 4 years before Dan and I went north, I took one of my neighborhood buddies on his first hunt for grouse. I coached him how to shoot a shotgun, taught him the hunting protocols, and told him about the pleasures of upland bird shooting. We never did jump a grouse that warm September afternoon. On the walk back to the car, we kicked up a cluster of frogs from the grass beside the marsh. My friend, frustrated that he had not killed a bird, emptied his shotgun on one jumping frog after another while cackling with an insane look on his face. His neck muscles shivered in his adrenaline rush. His body crouched like a frog. His eyes bulged crazily. This mild-mannered 18-year-old gave in to an enormous emotional greed for violence. My friend had never touched the carcasses of food animals. He did not know the coldness of the animal's death, nor did he honor the life-giving aspects of meat. I could not teach him that which I learned much later. A grateful relationship with nature must be sought and acknowledged when one hunts another life. If no relationship exists, then the activity is merely extermination. Extermination is the act of fear and greed gone amok. I saw this vividly. It disgusted me. I vowed to never again take a gun-toting neophyte into the woods. After that autumn alone with Dan, I slipped into the lifestyle and habits of the very fellows I had scoffed earlier. I became numbed and oblivious to any spiritual aspects of hunting. In August of 1974, I went with the neighborhood guys to shoot clay pigeons and prepare for the upcoming bird season. We were drinking beer, bragging to one another, insulting each other, and just being boorish. We were not paying attention to the natural environment. All we wanted to do was avoid the police and game wardens and enjoy our guns and beer. Such mindlessness is a prelude to danger and destruction. As we walked toward the backwaters of the Mississippi River, a wood duck suddenly lifted from a pothole. One friend, always a heavy drinker, swung toward the duck. His shotgun arced toward my head, and I dropped to the ground just before the blast. Had I not dropped, he would have killed me. I became so angry and rattled that I abandoned my friends to the slough and drove my car home. 4 of them had to cram into a small pickup. I had lost any meaningfulness for hunting. I almost died. For a week I replayed this near-death experience, and I remembered every violent, uncomfortable experience I had had while hunting. I had no sympathetic confidant, and I knew I no longer wanted to hunt. Over the next 10 years, I finished my undergraduate studies, returned to graduate school, wrote poetry, and performed poetry with musicians. Even though I did not hunt, I tried to feed the hunter inside me. I tracked beauty. I hunted spiritual texts, art, music, and quiet moments in the natural world. Often, I went alone to libraries, concerts, and museums. I needed the time to seriously examine beauty without obligations to a date or companion. These experiences felt similar to those I had found in the woods, in a canoe, or walking in the snow. Ironically, the path I followed with poetry folks led me back to, rather than away from, hunting. I became generally familiar with Native American beliefs. I listened to politically active Native Americans, and I paid close attention to the hunting lessons woven throughout their indigenous stories and literature. Meridel Lusur, the octogenarian grandmother of the peace and justice community, also taught that life is circular and cyclical, and she encouraged the publication of my poetry, which included the imagery of hunting. From the work of great American poets, I collected poems about the depth of hunting experience. And I was surprised to find that when they did write about hunting, almost all of our great poets wrote reverently. When I followed poet Robert Bly into the woods for one of his men's conferences, I found new teachers, white men who had learned traditional knowledge from indigenous teachers. Among the various teachings about the soul, those men spoke of valuable lessons to be learned from proper and respectful hunting. Some teachers taught in the manner of indigenous people, through stories rather than lectures, through poetry and music rather than training videos, and with conscientious rituals that revered and honored all living things. Then I married. My wife brought her young son to my house, and we had another son. A deep force swelled into me. I felt it as a father and a hunter. My 5 brothers, my father, and other relatives continued to hunt, and they continued to invite me to deer camp. They knew that I felt the need to return to hunting. Something primal aroused me. I now had a deeper context for hunting rituals. When I needed a respite from fatherhood, I began weekly trips to parks just outside the Twin Cities. I practiced stalking deer, just as the tracker John Stokes had taught at a conference. I tracked animals in the snow until I found their winter homes. With the help of guidebooks and gathering bags, I more urgently identified various plants and animals. In all kinds of weather, I sat for long periods and sensed the incredible richness of life and the teeth of death which fed the living. Then I bought a bow. I wanted to know the quiet hunt a bow hunter knows. I wanted to learn the patient skills and to be physically and spiritually connected to the woods and my prey. Martin Prechtel taught that a young man must fall in love with the goddess nature, so that he can throw his soul's great expectations to her rather than onto his human lover. Large expectations and fantasies become debilitating to the human women men love. The intensity of one's inner life can never be fully handled by another human, despite our romanticized expectations of marriage and relationships. Nature, on the other hand, can accept and handle all the emotional turmoil and grief a man is willing to express. The grief and attention we offer to divine nature is like candy to her. When we give our grief in tears, we feed her and cleanse ourselves. I was falling in love again, this time with the goddess. I understood the importance for myself, my sons, and my wife. After a couple of years as an unsuccessful bow hunter, I wondered what I was doing wrong. I knew only a few conventional bow hunters with whom I did not feel comfortable. So I continued to read for practical and spiritual advice. One book contained the songs Pueblo peoples sang for success on a hunt. One song addressed the cougar as the king of hunters. No melody was indicated in the book. Since I lived near the Como Park Zoo, I visited the cougars one Monday morning in October, after I had practiced at the archery range. The morning was bright and the high sky was deep blue. The cougar's den had been built from concrete and shaped as a mountain crag, where they lounged in the sun. The zoo was quiet, nearly empty. The cougars watched me intently. I spoke to them quietly about why I had come to visit. Then I sang a melody that popped into my head, and I adapted the words from the Pueblo verses. He comes alive, alive, he comes alive. He comes alive, alive, he comes alive. He comes alive, alive, he comes alive. The Lion of the North, he comes alive. That evening, I left for northern Minnesota. As I approached my freeway exit near midnight, I saw the shadowy form of a medium-sized cougar seated beside the freeway. As I turned onto the exit, the cat ran into the woods. I felt stunned and awed. The next day I returned to verify what I thought I had seen. Sure enough, I found a cougar's spoor and some scat on a sandy logging road. I took it to be a sign, and I hunted that area. After only a half hour, a doe came running directly at me. I drew my bow and waited. But at about 30 yards, she saw me just as I was about to shoot. She spun behind a pussy willow bush. Directly behind her, a very small yearling came running. Behind the yearling, something else moved in the tall grass. The yearling spun with its mother, and they ran across the open swath of clear-cut forest. I was not capable of shooting a deer fleeing at full speed, but it didn't matter. It was a timeless moment. A surge of awe and grace and joy came from a deep place inside me. I had been part of a cooperative hunt with a cougar. Just as the indigenous teachings had promised, I received assistance from the king of the hunt. I had ritualized my prayers in song. The cougar had chased 2 deer toward me, one for me and one for him. However, I was still too inept to fulfill my part of the bargain. As my gratitude swelled, I gave loud, grateful apologies to the unseen predator. A spiritual dimension opened. I felt blessed by unseen forces. 3 years later, Martine Prechtel told me how to ritually make amends to the spirit of the cougar through prayers and offerings. When I prayed directly to the cougar spirit, when I gave it ritual gifts, I found another layer of meaning to the hunt: reciprocation. In the spiritual dimension reached through ritual, the intention of one's heart can penetrate ignorance and pain and can heal the soul. That winter, I finally bought a Winchester rifle and an over and under Winchester double-barreled shotgun from a retired military friend. The following November, I joined my brothers and family for another annual deer hunt. My brothers knew of my years studying the literary and spiritual dimensions of hunting. They knew that I went with groups of men to study the outdoors, old folk tales, and the cultural traditions which bonded men in the unique matters of the soul. They also knew the cougar story, and they knew that I now valued the hunt as a sacred ritual activity. I had told them personal stories about my experiences with the teachers, the poets, and the men at these conferences. They were aware, yet wary of my attitudes. In the week before opening day, my brother Jake told me he was glad that I would join them. "You're the only one who will understand this," he said. "Whenever I've killed a deer, before I do anything else, I put a little pine bow in its mouth, and I ask it to forgive me, and I thank it for becoming food for my family." His words were almost the exact words I had read in hunting stories from tribal peoples. He knew instinctively what I had needed to learn. I had also learned that the act of putting grass in the deer's mouth was an ancient medieval German rite. Jake was not surprised, but pleased when I told him that. As I rode north with a second brother, Tony, we jabbered about our families, politics, union work, and current events. After a conversational pause, he said, "Well, I'm really glad you're hunting with us. You're the only one who'll understand this. Whenever I kill a deer, before I gut it, I whisper a little prayer of thanks to God and to the deer. I know the church wouldn't see it as appropriate, but I think it's necessary." I sat quietly, grinning, and said, "Thanks for having me with you." 2 of my 5 brothers, who had been hunting together for years, were praying for the souls of their deer kills, and they were embarrassed to do so openly, although neither was ashamed to pray at church. On opening morning, I hunted from a deer stand on Dan's woodland. He has hunted more than the rest of us, and his knowledge about the animals, their behaviors, and habitats probably exceeds the cumulative knowledge of his brothers. He has also had a ritual which he performs after every successful hunt. Once he kills a large animal, he cuts out its tenderloin, the love muscle, as he says, from behind the heart cavity. As soon as possible, he fries it and shares small pieces with whomever is near. His tradition is similar to the rituals of tribal people who ritually cook and eat a piece of the heart to honor the individual animal and to absorb some of its personal strength. After a few icy hours sitting in the tree stand, I heard him shoot. I waited a while, then crawled down and walked through the snow toward him. As I came from behind a stand of fir trees, I saw him kneeling over a fallen deer, whispering in its ear and patting it on the head. I allowed him time to finish, then noisily approached as he began to gut the deer. I did not say much to my brothers about what I knew of their private sacred rituals. But over the years, I purposely spoke about my own need to pray for the animals, for thanks, for the rituals, and for the family bonds that are strengthened by our hunt. Always they nodded and said little, but I could see that they agreed. Finally, on one hunting trip after I had been hunting with them for a few years, I prayed openly over a deer, the way one teacher had taught. It felt awkward to me, but my brothers gave me respectful space for my words of gratitude. That evening, after a first course of venison tenderloin cooked in butter, we ate a dinner of buttercup squash and green beans from Dad's garden, a pork roast from Jake's farm-raised pig, and a cake sent north by Mom. Uncle Bill came by to visit, and while he and Dad talked in the cabin, the rest of us, including my other brothers Joe and Chris, went out beneath the spectacularly lit Milky Way, and we smoked cigars in the dark. We spoke together of the spiritual dimensions of the hunt. They even let me recite a few hunting poems. Brothers, a brother-in-law, nephews, all of us speaking in reverence for the mystery of life's basic law. Something dies so another can live.